Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 6 of Poll 101 American Government. This week, we're discussing the American news media. And I'm going to try to make this lecture a little on the short side because you do have another documentary to watch this week. We're going to jump right in by talking about the purpose of the American news media. I want to talk about media ownership in this country. We're going to talk briefly about media consumption statistics. So who's most likely to get their news from where and what are the consequences of that behavior. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a discussion on regulating the media. And I'd love to hear in the discussion boards this week what your ideas are for responsible media regulation and whether or not you think that these reforms could fix things like political polarization or make government officials more accountable. So with all that being said, we got a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and jump right in. I want to begin this lecture with a stop and think moment. I want you to consider, what is the purpose of the American news media? And thinking broadly, what is the purpose of news media in a democracy? What is its objective? What role or function does it serve? So go ahead and pause, take a moment to think about that, and hit play when you're ready to proceed. Now, generally, when I ask this question in my classes, students come up with a lot of really great answers that in a democracy, the purpose of news media is to inform and educate the citizenry. It's to provide information to help individuals hold elected officials and the government accountable for their actions. The news media helps provide information that allows us to objectively assess political and social issues. And more importantly, the media serves a watchdog function, right? It should exist to help call attention to crises or other types of inequality so that individuals may collectively organize to help address these issues. And while all of these are great answers that I totally agree with, there's one particular issue that often goes overlooked. And because so much of American news media is privately owned, the biggest objective of American news media is to make a profit. And here's where I want to talk about the 3 C's of the American news media: corporate, concentrated, and conglomerate. Corporate, because most of American media is privately owned. Concentrated, because just a few companies own most media outlets in this country. And conglomerate, because not only do these small number of companies own most of the news that we consume, but they actually own countless other media enterprises such as film studios, magazines, newspapers, and even video game studios. You may be shocked to learn that just 6 companies own over 90% of all American media. That's National Amusements, Disney, Time Warner, Comcast, News Corp, and Sony. And let's just look at a few of these in a little bit more detail. Let's start with National Amusements, which is owned by Sumner Redstone, who has a net worth of $4.6 billion. You'll notice that the television and film assets of National Amusements are channels that you're probably very familiar with. There's CBS, MTV, Nickelodeon, Paramount, Showtime, Spike, VH1, all kinds of channels, right? Moving over to Disney. Disney owns A&E, ABC, ESPN, History Channel, Marvel Studios, Lucasfilm, all kinds of assets are owned by Disney. We can look at Time Warner, which owns CNN, obviously Warner Brothers Studios, HBO, Hulu. And then finally, News Corp, right, which is led by Rupert Murdoch, and News Corp is most known for its ownership of the Fox broadcast suite. And so what I want you taking away from these graphics that we just looked at is that, while there are hundreds of channels for us to choose from when it comes to entertainment and news, it looks like we have a lot of choice, but really this is an illusion of choice because all of these companies, over 90% of American media, is controlled by just 6 companies. And so if you've ever wondered to yourself, why isn't it that, these major news networks, why don't they spend more time talking about wealth inequality in this country or, holding the 1% economically accountable? Well, that's because it's precisely those individuals who own the news media. So of course it's not in their interest to cover stories like that. That wouldn't look very good for their PR. And just to put it into context, right, there is an enormous amount of wealth in these companies. Not surprisingly, the Big Six constitute one of the world's largest, most profitable industries. If we look at the total value of the Big Six, Comcast, Disney, National Amusements, News Corp, Time Warner, and Sony, combined, they're worth about $430 billion. That's enough money to buy every NFL team 23 times over. It's about equal to the entire GDP of the country of Bangladesh in 2023, and it's nearly 3 times the amount that the federal government allocated to Americans in the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And so another thing that I want you to think about is that, you can go to Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, ABC. You can go to these websites and you can read these news stories mostly free of charge, right? I mean, if you want to stream these sites 24/7, you'll need, either a cable package or a live streaming service. But for the most part, access to this news is mostly free. So how do media companies make such an enormous profit? And I'll actually let you pause the video for a moment if you'd like to think about that before I reveal the answer. And the answer to this question actually applies across the board. If you're not paying for a product, you are the product. And here we're talking about the enormous amount of wealth that's accrued through advertising revenue. So how do media companies ensure that we keep coming back for more and keep consuming all this advertising content? Well, the algorithms have gotten really good at tracking our internet profile and knowing exactly what type of content that we want to consume. So these news media outlets can make sure that they cater to our every want and whim. The news media sets the agenda by telling us what news stories we need to think about each day, or as we just discussed earlier, prevents us from learning about certain stories that they would prefer we not know about. There are constant notifications, alerts, and alarms that keep us checking our phones all day. Social media companies, in fact, have been very transparent about how they have designed their platforms to be as addictive as possible, taking cues from the gambling industry. And as a consequence, news media content is becoming more and more partisan and more polarized in order to set itself apart from the competition. And here I want to introduce you to Vanessa Otero's media bias chart. So the graph that we're looking at here ranks most of the major news media platforms on the y-axis here by their value and their reliability, also on the x-axis here by their left or right political bias. So we'll see that we've got a few really trusted centrist sources here in the middle of this graphic. So sources like PBS, ABC, BBC, AP, Reuters, things like that. But what's really interesting is all of this activity that we see happening in the tails of this distribution. Why do we have so many sources here on the bottom left and the bottom right corner? Well, in a competitive marketplace where, these actors need to distinguish themselves from each other, what media companies have found a great amount of success in is radicalizing their content. That if they can be the leftmost or the rightmost extreme news media out there, that they're going to be catering to individuals who are constantly craving information, and they can be as outlandish and radical as possible. In this way, they differentiate themselves from the competition. They have very loyal followers, and they're able to make a killing off of these viewers when it comes to ad revenue. So when we want to understand why American media is so fragmented and so polarized, the number one answer that I would give to explaining that is, well, it's all tangled up in market motivations. These companies want to maximize their profits, and by radicalizing their content, we've seen various news media outlets be very successful and profitable in that method. Okay, moving on, I do want to talk briefly about news media consumption statistics. So in our last lecture, we had talked about how only about 32% of Americans report that they follow national headlines very closely. That statistic came from a 2023 Gallup article. And so I want you thinking about, first of all, why is it that less than a third of Americans are closely following news headlines? Is that more about how the news covers certain stories? Is it more about a reflection of the state of current affairs in this country? Why do you think that just a third of Americans follow national headlines very closely? And then so keeping in mind, right, that also building upon last week's lecture that political knowledge is kind of lacking in this country, I also want to consider what role different types of news media sources play in public opinion. So here we can look at where are people most likely to get their news from. And so looking at Pew Research data from 2020, we see that overwhelmingly among those who are consuming the news, right, 86% of them either often or sometimes get their news from a smartphone, computer, or a tablet. 68% rely on television, broadcast news. 50% get their news from the radio. And just about 32% rely on print publications. And so start thinking about how these different modalities might impact the content of the media that we consume. We're going to come back to this a little later in the lecture. I also want to break down news consumption habits by age cohort because there's some really interesting dynamics happening here. Let's look at the Gen Z cohort, individuals aged between 18 and 29. We see some really interesting patterns. 71% of people in this age group get their news from either a smartphone, computer, or tablet. We see, for the most part, similar behaviors among individuals aged between 30 and 49, but once we get to individuals age 50 or over, we see that television is the primary method by which most individuals get their news. So again, think about this, right? I don't know if you frequently watch broadcast news, probably not. Maybe for this week's homework, watch an episode of NBC Nightly News or something. And I want you to consider how the content on broadcast news might vary from what we see on our smartphones or on social media, for instance. Now, the very last graph that I want to show you really breaks down, when it comes to online news, what sources are people using. So again, when we look at people aged 18 to 29, overwhelmingly, 42% of individuals in that age range are getting their news from social media. And that's unique to this age cohort. Every other age cohort is most likely to get their online news from news websites or news-related apps. And here's a big question, right? What is the big difference between getting your news on a place like TikTok or going to NewYorkTimes.com to get your news? We're going to come back to it in just a moment, but start thinking about what those main differences might be. And here's where I'd like to introduce the main prompt for discussion that I'd like everyone in the class to do this week. I want us to, as a group, right, as a class, kind of assess where you get your news from and the type of content that you're exposed to. So first, I want you to think about, where are you most likely to get your news from? Is it social media? Is it a dedicated news app? Where are you going to get your news? Second, I want you to go to the platform that you usually use when you see news stories, and I want you to jot down the first 2 or 3 news stories that you see. I'm really excited for this activity because I'm recording this lecture on August 13th, and if I've done my math right, I think that you'll be doing this activity like in the middle of October, so we should be really close to the election by the time you're watching this. I just can't wait to see what type of content you guys are reading, or, and more importantly, what type of content the algorithms are encouraging you to read. At any rate, what I want you to do in the discussion boards is discuss the topic or the theme of the content of the news stories that you're being exposed to. Are the headlines mostly political? Are they international in nature? Do they mainly focus on pop culture? culture? Are they crime-based? What exactly is the content that's being fed to you? And then once everyone's had an opportunity to post, I'd like you to assess how similar or dissimilar your headlines were from the rest of the class. I think that this will be an illuminating exercise to see, is there a lot of variability in the type of content that you guys are reading, or is it frighteningly all very, very similar? And then lastly, once you've had a time to post your responses, see what others have said, responded to others, I want you to take a moment to go to a news source that you consider to be reputable and professional. And I'm going to leave that up to you to decide what you think that is. I want you to discuss why you chose that news source, why you consider it to be reputable. Here we're kind of getting into an exercise of media literacy. So what are the criteria that you use to determine the legitimacy of, various news sources? And what I would like you to do quickly is a brief reflection. How did the news stories, the front page news stories on a website that you consider to be legitimate and very reputable, how did the content of those stories differ from what I assume are, for most of the class, are the news stories that you're exposed to on social media? So I think that this will be a really fun exercise, and I can't wait to see all the different posts from you guys. So next I want to provide a little bit more information with respect to the legitimacy of these different media types by source. And I want to highlight the code of ethics that professional media must abide by, right? So we're talking about print media and broadcast media, and I think your book might get into this. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we can go back to the 1920s and 30s when the era of yellow journalism and sensationalism was really damaging the reputation of the news media. And they said, hey, if we want our industry to survive and we want people to think that we are legitimate at what we do, we need to start following a code of ethics. And so I've got that here, right? It's 4 main points when reporting the news. We must seek the truth and report it accurately, minimize harm, act independently, be accountable, and be transparent, right? We don't have this same code of ethics when it comes to how we proliferate news information on social media. There's a very limited, if not non-existent, code of ethics on social media. Perhaps the closest thing that we could come to would be a terms of service. But even then, we see many social media platforms don't do a great job of enforcing terms of service. There's very little regulation of users' content. Even if there is a violation of terms of service, what does that result in? A temporary suspension for improper content? Again, you could just create a new email address and you're back on the platform in 5 minutes. There's very little emphasis on truth or combating false information. And most importantly, crediting social media as a source has very little standing in our society, right? If you were to write an academic research paper for one of your college professors and you were citing your sources with, well, I read on X, or, I saw this video on TikTok, right? We don't consider those credible sources because literally anyone can post anything on social media with very little fact-checking, regulation, or oversight. They're just simply not credible sources. And that leads us to considering the pros and cons of each of these major media types. So when it comes to print news, when we're talking about professional journalism, generally this is regarded as the most sophisticated type of news that you can consume. The articles are longer, they take the most time to synthesize, the content is fact-checked by an editorial team, and accidental exposure is least likely, meaning that there's the least amount of kind of like manipulation being exerted to influence your opinion. And so when we're talking about accidental exposure, I think the best way to think about this is, you're watching a YouTube video, right? And as soon as that video ends, the platform decides for you what you should watch next via its recommended video function. And that way, we're being exposed to information that we didn't really have a direct hand in choosing. We were exposed to that information accidentally. That doesn't happen in print news. You open up a newspaper, You see the headline, you either decide to read it or don't. You are not exposed to information accidentally. Whereas on social media, that algorithm is constantly feeding you information you did not deliberately choose yourself. So again, I want you to think about this concept of accidental exposure and how that might influence our opinions, not only about the media, but, government and democracy at large. Next, we can move on to broadcast news. Broadcast news can cater to local, national, or international audiences. It's easy to comprehend, not as sophisticated. The average person can synthesize this information relatively easily, and news is presented on a 24/7 cycle, so accidental exposure becomes a little bit more likely than print. And then finally, we have online media or social media, where we have massive user-generated content. It is generally it has the potential for the least sophisticated information. Information is presented briefly and quickly. It takes the least amount of time to synthesize. And again, accidental exposure is most likely. So again, I would like you to compare the pros and cons of these media types with respect to the graph that we looked at earlier. And to what degree can we explain our political differences, kind of on the basis of age cohort, with respect to where we're getting our news information from? Does the fact that, younger Americans are most likely to get their news from social media, does that have a impact on their political values, their attitudes, and their ideologies, and how might that come at odds with other generations that get their news media from other sources? So that's a point that I would love to see you guys expand upon in the discussions in a little bit more detail. Okay, and for the last part of this lecture, I really want to talk about how we regulate the media, or whether we should regulate the media, and what kind of consequences might that have on American public opinion. And what I want you to take away from this lecture is that for the most part, our media is pretty unregulated. And so what are the consequences of an unregulated media? Well, it causes people to become radicalized, as we looked at the Vanessa Otero media bias chart. There is a market motivation for media outlets to be extreme, to capitalize on those audiences, and in turn, that radicalizes individuals. It enables people to believe in and share information that's categorically false and misleading. It generates echo chambers and communities of conspiracy theorists, and it breeds distrust in media, government, and society. Now, the documentary that I have assigned this week goes into a ton of detail on this that I think is super fascinating, but I'm just going to show you a couple graphs that I think emphasize these points really well, specifically our distrust in media. This is shocking. Only about 36% of Americans have either a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the mass media. That's shocking, right? Only just a little more than a third of Americans trust the information spread in our media. But what happens when we break that down by partisanship? We see night and day differences. Almost 70% of Democrats trust the news media, compared to just 11% of Republicans. And as always, we see independents in the middle at about 31%. But what do you think explains this drastic difference? Why do you think 70% of Democrats trust the news compared to just 11%? Very curious to hear your thoughts in the discussion board. And we have to think about the impact and the consequences that this attitude has on other topics. It's not surprising that simultaneously we are also witnessing a historic decline in trust in the federal government. Only about 39% of Americans trust a great deal or a fair amount in the federal government's ability to handle problems. So we have to ask ourselves, when a majority, right, when 60% of Americans don't trust the government to do what's right, they don't trust the government to handle problems, how can a democracy function? How can it do its job when Americans overwhelmingly don't trust in its ability to get things done? And what kind of impact does that have on the policies we support or the types of candidates we support. So again, lots of potential prompts and ideas for you to consider in the discussion board this week. Let's go ahead and transition to final thoughts. And I want you to think about what the political consequences are of absolute freedom of speech versus absolute control of speech, going way back to conversations we had in week 1 and week 2 of this class. In the documentary this week, an excerpt from Plato's Republic is referenced, whereby Plato argues that freedom of speech and allowing people to govern themselves leads directly to tyranny. And I want you to think about this. What do you think Plato means by this? And how does this statement relate to topics that we discussed in week 1 regarding human nature and the purpose of government? Does democracy inevitably lead to tyranny? And the last thing I want you to consider is whether stronger media regulations will decrease or accelerate the threat of tyranny to our democracy. In other words, is it possible to regulate speech in a way that both reduces political polarization while also simultaneously protecting the people from excessive government censorship? Now, North Korea's authoritarian control of the media is often used as an example to highlight the dangers of excessive government control and why the government can't overregulate freedom of speech. So, for instance, in the country of North Korea, all media is controlled by the government. TV sets are pre-tuned to government stations, radios must be checked and registered with local authorities, and only a small amount of elites can access the internet. So in a country with a population of 26 million people, the country only has about 1,000 IP addresses. Moreover, individuals can face life in prison for making statements that are critical of the North Korean government. So clearly there's a boundary here, right? There is anarchy where people are allowed to say whatever it is they want, whenever they want, and that leads to radicalization and all kinds of other problems. And then we have the other side of the spectrum, which is a total authoritarian crackdown on speech. Is it possible for there to be a middle ground? And I'm curious to hear, in your opinion, what we could do, what reforms you would be in favor of to help de-radicalize and defragment our media and put us on a healing journey in our democracy. But at any rate, so much to discuss. I'm going to go ahead and end it here. I hope you enjoyed. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.